It's really important to be paying attention to sleep as a way of managing your hormones. If you have just one night of bad sleep, that's associated with issues with your insulin the next day, issues with your glucose. Typically, glucose is higher. You've got a higher cortisol response. You may crave more sugar, more carbohydrates as a result.
Welcome back to the podcast. It's been a while. How you doing?
So good, Jesse. Happy to be with you.
We're going to have a great conversation. You have another book out, and I think a great place to start is just talking a little bit about your story and how you got into hormones. This is an area you've been studying for a lot of years. It's become your real area of expertise. Let's go to the origin of that. Where does that come from?
It comes from when I was a hormonal hot mess. So it began in my 30s. One of the things that happened for me is that when I was pregnant with my first baby, I went and did that 1 hour glucose tolerance test, where you drink the soda and then you get your blood drawn an hour later. And my level was borderline. So my score was 134 milligrams per deciliter. That is 1 point below the cutoff for then doing a 3 hour gestational diabetes test. And at that moment, I went to my doctor who said, "Oh, don't worry about it. You're fine. Don't drink juice." But the truth was, there was this whole story, this whole backstory of my metabolism becoming out of whack, my metabolic health declining, and I didn't really know it. So fast forward to 10 years later, I'm in my 40s. I am diagnosed with prediabetes. I decide to go on a ketogenic diet with my husband. He drops 20 pounds, and I lost weight initially, and then I actually gained weight. And I realized, wow, the ketogenic diet was developed by a male physician. Most of the research has been done in men, like especially looking at metabolism, about 80% of it's in men. And so I felt like I want to understand what's different about the female body. How do we understand some of the drivers of metabolism, not just for weight loss, but to improve metabolic health? So that's really the origin of this book, Women, Food, and Hormones.
Well, Sarah, it sounds like it took you quite a long time to figure out exactly what was happening in your body. So there's probably a lot of women and maybe men as well listening who are dealing with certain symptoms and haven't yet nailed down what is causing those. So I think it's really important we talk about what somebody might be experiencing if their hormones are out of whack right now.
Well, there's a lot of different symptoms that can get mapped onto different hormonal issues. If we start first with cortisol, that's the one that's up for me today. So that's the first that comes to mind. Cortisol is involved in a number of different things, certainly the stress response, but a lot of people don't realize that cortisol is also involved in the immune system, kind of how robustly your immune system reacts, how hypervigilant it is. And it also controls glucose. So it's one of those hormones that works together with insulin as well as a few other metabolic hormones. And when cortisol is out of whack, like it was for me, you can feel tired but wired. You can have increased belly fat because belly fat has 4 times the number of cortisol receptors as fat elsewhere. You can, there's kind of two different groupings. You can have too much cortisol, which is associated with depression, mood issues, metabolic syndrome. It's also a suicide marker. And then you can also have not enough cortisol, which is associated with fibromyalgia and the worst type of immune dysregulation, where you can be prone to infection, especially viral infection. Now, some folks, myself included, can have both high cortisol and low cortisol within the same day. So, cortisol is a really important one. Another, there's dozens of hormones that are involved in metabolism. Another one is thyroid. So, some of the common symptoms involved in what I think of as thyropause, where thyroid starts to not work quite as well. This is about 7 to 10 times more common in women than men. That includes hair loss, uh, cold hands, cold feet, constipation, just feeling like you're gaining weight sort of all over, not in one particular place. You may feel puffiness. You might notice that your cholesterol is starting to rise. Thyroid, I think of as kind of the gas pedal of your metabolism. And when you don't have enough thyroid hormone, which is known as hypothyroidism, that can be associated with weight gain, with fatigue, and some of these other symptoms that I've described. You can also have excess thyroid hormone that occurs with a lot of people with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, kind of in the first phase of their illness. And then they get more of a burnout phase, which is hypothyroidism. Another one is testosterone. And this is one I haven't talked about as much in my previous books, Jesse, because what I noticed in terms of metabolism is that for both men and women, testosterone is so important and it can start to decline in your late 20s, your early 30s, depending on how much stress you have, because cortisol is kind of cross-talking with many of these hormones, but also how much sugar you consume, how much coffee you consume, the type of protein that you consume, whether you eat out at restaurants a lot, that's associated with lower testosterone levels. And for women, testosterone is the most abundant hormone. We often think that estrogen is, but even though we have, as women, 10 times less testosterone than men, it's still something that we're exquisitely sensitive to because it's our most abundant. So those are a few of the metabolic hormones. Insulin, of course, is so crucial. It's what controls glucose. I think of it like the bouncer at the club, where it kind of stands outside the stall and helps to determine whether glucose will go into the cell, like, a bouncer letting people into the club. And if insulin's not working well, if your cells become numb to insulin, which is known as insulin resistance, then you've got all these people kind of running around in the bloodstream, all this glucose, and glucose can rise, insulin can rise. And that leads to fat storage and more hunger as well as cravings. Another hormone is growth hormone. It's another one that I haven't talked about much until this book, but it's important to know about growth hormone because it's, as you might imagine from the name of it, it's involved in the growth and maintenance of many cells in your body, especially your muscles. It's also involved in belly fat, and women actually make more growth hormone than men until menopause. And then at menopause, we've got the sudden decrease in growth hormone. And that can lead to more fatigue, more sagging of skin. You can also get longitudinal lines on your nails. Um, in the book, I've got a list of some of the symptoms that are common that kind of group to each of these hormone imbalances. So I probably left out a whole bunch of them, but those are the key ones that I talk about in the book.
Well, that gives us a great start. And as you're explaining all this with, going into thorough detail here, I'm feeling for the person listening who's like, okay, there's so many different symptoms that I can be experiencing when different hormones are out of whack. So, if somebody is suspecting maybe they're suffering right now from a hormone issue, is there a certain comprehensive test they can have done that kind of assesses their whole hormone profile so they can kind of figure out in the beginning what changes they need to make?
Certainly. So I practice precision medicine. And the questions that I have in the book, so I've got three different chapters that involve questionnaires. The questionnaires are the very questions that I ask my patients to be able to map what I think the hormones are that are out of whack. But you can certainly do testing. The gold standard in conventional medicine is to do blood work. So you can do blood work to look at the levels of all of these: testosterone, insulin, glucose, thyroid function, as well as growth hormone. We use IGF-1 as a proxy for growth hormone because it's hard to measure. The other thing that you can do, I mean, what I do on pretty much all of my patients, whether they're male or female, is I do blood work together with a comprehensive test such as the Dutch test. So I really like the Dutch dried urine test because it tells us not just about the production and the levels of hormones, it tells us about metabolism and detoxification. So that's an important learning, I think, when it comes to hormones. It's not just the level that you want to pay attention to. You want to pay attention to the production, the transportation. So that usually involves things like sex hormone binding globulin, the carrier proteins that carry free hormone versus, the bound hormone and then allows for free hormone. We also want to think about sensitivity and detoxification. So the mnemonic is PTSD. It's kind of an unfortunate mnemonic, but it helps you to think about this larger context of how we manage hormones.
And when it comes to treating somebody, maybe they have different hormonal issues, everybody's going to be different, the depths that they're suffering and what hormones are impacted. When it comes to treatment and working with somebody, does the protocol look very similar? I know in the book you have a 4-week protocol that people go through to reset and rebalance. Is that kind of the gold standard for you when you're working with somebody to get things back in order, no matter what hormones are out of whack?
Well, what I know from the literature is that 88% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy. So I can tell you among my patient population, that is definitely true. In fact, it might even be higher because of the type of people that are attracted to my practice. So if we just assume that 88% of our listeners are metabolically unhealthy, the protocol is designed to address that. Now, the individual hormones, kind of the contribution of testosterone and growth hormone and insulin, those are all managed by the protocol. So the protocol is, uh, it kind of applies across the board. But I would say when I'm working one on one with someone, we might be a little more specific about the types of protein that are going to help. We might be using something like a continuous glucose monitor to really understand the person's individual response to different foods. So, what I can offer with the book is the main tenets of the kind of protocol that I design for patients that will work across the board and has worked across the board for my patients for the past few years. But then the customization that comes with one-on-one work goes, I would say, a layer deeper.
Right. So what I'm hearing you say, this could be a good baseline for somebody to go through the 4 weeks. And then if that point they're still suffering with certain symptoms, maybe some further testing is warranted at that time, and then some more specific modifications of diet and lifestyle.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think we're heading in a really interesting direction, Jesse. You bring up an important point here, which is the medicine that I learned. So this is starting, 32 years ago when I first went to medical school. The medicine I learned was medicine for the average, medicine for the population, where we had randomized trials. If you had someone with prediabetes, you would look up, what's the latest research on the randomized trial of a particular intervention for prediabetes. We're now shifting to a completely different paradigm, which is medicine for the individual. So, what works for you may not be the same thing that works for me. And so, what we can do is design these N of one experiments. And that is the primary tool of precision medicine, where we take medicine for the average and then we test it in you to see if it's true for you. So, you're right. We want to customize it. We want to kind of take the best of both worlds, start with what we've learned from the population based, evidence based, and then see if that applies through N of one experimentation. And this may sound really complicated. The truth is, most of us are doing N of one experiments all the time. You may not call it that, but I remember, when I first went paleo, back when the paleo movement began. So this was, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago. And I found that it wasn't the best fit for me. And I was like, total head scratcher. I couldn't understand why that was. And then I got a continuous glucose monitor about 4 years ago. I've worn one ever since. And I found that a lot of the foods that I was eating, including sweet potatoes, would spike my glucose up to the diabetes range. So it's that kind of personalization that I think is really important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think an important thing to highlight too, as you say that, is this is a long journey. This is, where you're at today. We might talk in 5 years and there might be some new technology and you'll likely have refined things. And I continue to do the same as well because everything's changing all the time with technology and what we're able to, learn about our bodies using that. So I think people need to really be patient, look at it like a long journey and not in a discouraging way. in a realistic, optimistic way where it's like I'm going to continue to learn and continue to layer these things in as I go. And then I can look back 10 years and see, all the great changes I've made and the improvements in my health and well-being.
Yeah, Jesse, you just did a beautiful benevolent thing there where you talked about how we've got to be tracking the right things and we need to be compassionate about how long it takes to turn the ship. So, what I see since this book pubbed, we were very fortunate to make it on the New York Times for a couple of weeks. And so we were able to get the word out. And what I saw on social media was that there are lots of people who were saying, "Oh my gosh, I love this protocol. I've lost 10 pounds in the first 2 weeks." Or, I've noticed that my cravings are gone, or there's some other outcome that they've noticed. And then I have other people who are only weighing themselves on a scale, a bathroom scale, and they're saying, "I've only lost 5 pounds in 4 weeks." And so if I go back to them and I say, "Okay, have you measured anything else? What was your fasting glucose before you started?" And they'll say, "Oh, well, my fasting glucose has gone down 20 points." And I'm like, "Yay!" I mean, that's what we're looking for. Even if the progress with weight loss is slow, often under the hood, there are these metabolic changes that are occurring that we want to tune into. And in many ways, I think that's more important than the number on the bathroom scale. I don't want this book to be pigeonholed as diet culture because what I want is to reverse this epidemic that we have of people who've got metabolic dysfunction.
That makes sense. Well, let's talk about the diet piece. This is the biggest piece that you highlight in the latest book for people that want to make changes with their hormones. So, somebody listening right now, they want to start making some of the bigger changes to their diet. Where do they begin?
So I like to start with detoxification. It's the first pillar of this protocol. And the reason why I start with detoxification is because when I go back and I look at my failure with the ketogenic diet, what I realized was that my detox pathways were not open. So I was producing a number of different things. I'm just thinking kind of theoretically here, and I was not detoxifying some of that fat that I was liberalizing. So I think detox is really important. I think men probably get away with less detoxification than women, but it's also important for the men. So for women especially who are more vulnerable to endocrine disruptors, to uh, the kind of toxins that we get exposed to daily, as well as those that can be liberated by a ketogenic diet, we want detox in place. So, what I advise people to do is to make sure that they're eating plenty of the detoxifying vegetables. So, that includes the cruciferous vegetables, radishes, broccoli, cauliflower, broccoli sprouts, Brussels sprouts. It includes the allium vegetables. So, that's the garlic, the leeks, the onion that helps you with making glutathione, which is the master antioxidant and kind of mops up the toxins. And then, third, you want those methylating vegetables. Those are the vegetables that help you inactivate, especially the estrogens that you've used. And now you need to get rid of them so that they don't turn into, kind of the Homer Simpson type of estrogens. So the methylating vegetables are mostly the dark green leafies. Those are the ones that are really rich in the B vitamins. So you want that detoxification in place, and you want to be pooping every single morning. So, what we know with the ketogenic diet is that if you follow a clean keto program, it helps you with pooping every day. But for some people who have a tendency toward constipation, it's very hard to detox unless you've got a bowel movement and you feel like you're evacuating every single morning. So, that also involves getting sufficient fluids, drinking filtered water every day. Electrolytes are also important on a ketogenic diet. So, all of that comes first. That's the first pillar.
So, when it comes to detox, just so I make sure I'm understanding this properly, is the idea that because we're going to be switching our fuel, we're going to be going from, a lot of people at least, are going to be going from burning sugars to burning fats when they go to a more ketogenic diet. And they're going to end up losing weight, which is where our bodies primarily store a lot of the toxins we've accumulated. So basically, as we go through this protocol, we're going to be liberating a lot of those toxins that have been stored in the body fat, and we need to make sure we have our detox, our systems in our body working their best.
Yeah, that's right. So that's part of it. That's a big part of it because, I think the reason why I had initial success with the ketogenic diet and then I started to gain weight was this very problem that you just put your finger on. So, what happens for most of us when we're experiencing weight loss or fat loss, which is more accurate, as we start to burn our body fat stores, that is where toxins are stored. And so, if you look at someone who's day 0 on the protocol versus, say, day 14, we know that about by day 14, the body burden of toxins will go up by virtue of the increased fat loss. So, you want to be able to meet that increased body burden with your food and with your lifestyle practices. So, that's one piece. Another piece is just related to switching, toggling that switch as you described from burning glucose to burning fat. Switching back and forth, kind of depending on the fuel that you have available, is called metabolic flexibility. But when you start burning more fat and you're also consuming more fat, that can lead to elevations of other things, such as lipopolysaccharide. So we want to be thinking about how do we protect the body from some of these shifts so that those detox pathways are working for you, not against you. Now, one thing I hear as criticism from people who are more in the conventional world of medicine is that, oh, everybody has detoxification. The body does fine on its own. You don't have to worry about it. But if you take a look at my patients, at least, and I've got, a group of them that are in this book, if you look at their genomic drivers of detoxification, what we find is that they tend to be quite low in glutathione. They might have issues with the methylation pathway. I'm not talking just about MTHFR here. I'm talking about, there's about 9 to 12 SNPs that are involved in methylation. And what I find pretty routinely in my patients, about 88% of them, is that their detox pathways are not open. So, a big part of the work initially with them, kind of regardless of what the goal is to make sure those detox pathways are open.
And you talked about a number of foods that we can use to enhance the detox pathways. Let's talk about some of the other things people can do along with the foods, such as using a sauna, other modalities like that we can incorporate at this point.
Yeah, well, I feel like the queen of saunas. I just absolutely love saunas. I grew up uh, with a father who's part Finnish, and so we used to go to Minnesota and like go do the dry sauna and then go jump in the lake in Minnesota. So I'm a big fan of saunas. Basically, anything that helps you sweat is going to help you with detoxification. So saunas are a great choice. Dry saunas they have the most data associated with them, including reduced risk of cardiovascular mortality. But we also know that infrared saunas are very effective in terms of helping you with sweating. And then exercise. Exercise is another key part of this story in terms of helping you with sweating. What I find with a lot of women is that many of them are great at cardio. So maybe they've got a Peloton bike and they're, doing their rides every day. So they're great at cardio and they're not doing enough weight training. So, what I advise, based on looking at hundreds of citations on exercise and cardiometabolic health, what I advise is that all people, men and women, um, and gender non binary folks, I advise that you do 2/3 of weight training together with 1/3 of cardio. So, I think that combination is what works the best. And there's additional details in the book.
Got it. And when it comes to specific supplements that we can incorporate, again, along with the exercise, sauna, specific foods, what supplements can we layer in to enhance that detox?
Well, there's a lot of supplements. Some are more proven than others. I think probably the most proven supplement is N-acetylcysteine or NAC. So what I love about NAC is that it's very safe. It's a precursor to glutathione, so it's a way of producing more glutathione. At Thomas Jefferson University, where I'm a clinical assistant professor and the director of precision medicine, we've done a lot of research on IV NAC. And we found that IV NAC helps with so many different clinical conditions in which detoxification is an issue. And that includes Parkinson's, it includes multiple sclerosis. So these studies have been published, but you don't have to take IV NAC. That's actually a great way to get glutathione in the brain. But you can also take oral NAC. There's some others, like milk thistle, which helps with detoxification. There's you can take some of the things that are in cruciferous vegetables as a supplement, things like diindolylmethane, I3C, what we know, indole 3 carbinol. What we know is that, I really like to have a food first philosophy. So I'd like to get as much of these nutrients as we can from food and then to supplement wherever the gap is. Now, another category is sulforaphane. I think that's another really important detoxifier, as well as the B vitamins that are cofactors with the detoxification pathways in the liver. So that includes B2, B3, B6, B9, B12. Magnesium is another important one. I'm probably missing a few. Do you have any you want to add, Jesse?
No, I mean, you covered a lot there. And when it comes to this detoxification part of your protocol, how does it fit into the protocol as a whole? Like, do you recommend somebody as they're easing in and starting to work through, what we're going to get into next? Should they find a certain baseline with detox for a certain period of time before they, take on the next step?
Well, I really advise that you're having a bowel movement every single morning. So I think if you're pooping every day and you feel like you're evacuating completely, that would be the place to start in terms of moving on to the next part of the protocol, which is nutritional ketosis. So I think once you're eating, you know, uh, a sufficient amount of those vegetables that we talked about, and I generally recommend that you are aiming for somewhere around 20 to 25 net carbs per day from vegetables. So, almost entirely from vegetables. Once you have that in place together with pooping every day, then I think you're ready to move on to the next stage, which is nutritional ketosis.
Well, let's get into the details of what that looks like. I know from your book you're, not a fan, especially for women, of traditional keto. So let's talk about the nuances of the diet you recommend.
Yeah, the problem with classic keto, which is 70% of calories from fat, 20% of calories from protein, moderate protein, 10% of calories from carbs, is that most men do well with that, women not always. So there's some women who do well with classic keto, but what I find is that a lot of those folks are, getting the bacon cheeseburger wrapped in lettuce. They're not getting sufficient carbs to feed their microbiome. Their microbiome is suffering. And then for women in particular, we know that 45% in some series of women will have menstrual irregularity on classic keto. They also have more thyroid disruption. Women are more sensitive to thyroid disruption than men. And so, what happens when you restrict carbs too much, especially in women, is that it can elevate reverse T3. It can also raise cortisol. So men tolerate low carb better than women in terms of how that evokes a stress response. And then the third issue in women is that if you're not getting sufficient carbs, you may have less serotonin, and serotonin is so important for sleep. We know that women have about double the rate of insomnia as men, so I don't want to contribute to that by putting women on classic keto. So I like to adapt the ketogenic diet for women. We talked about the detoxification. The next step is to get about 60 to 70% of your calories from fat, mostly plant based fat. So, a lot of people, myself included, have some genetic variations, such as ApoA2, that's associated with more insulin resistance when they eat too much animal fat. So I prefer the plant-based fats. That's the avocados, the olives, the coconuts, coconut oil, avocado oil, nuts and seeds. All of those are the plant-based fats that I think are so healthy for us. You can certainly, I'm food agnostic. So if you're someone who's plant based, great, go for it. If you're someone who is more of an omnivore, we just want to be noticing how you respond to increased animal fat. So there was just a study published by David Ludwig showing that the best cardiometabolic diet, he did a randomized trial, was for people to be on a low carb, high fat diet with about 21% of their daily calories from animal fat. So that fits with the protocol that's in this book, even though his paper was published after this book was published. So that's what I advise in terms of fat. In terms of protein, I like 20% of calories from protein. And what we know is that there are certain hormones, such as growth hormone and testosterone, that respond better to animal based protein. So, this is another place where there's some nuance, and we want to be careful about that. I'm not trying to confuse people. I'm just trying to say that, for me, for instance, if I eat 20% of my calories from protein, that helps me preserve muscle mass over time. And it works really well for a lot of my patients. For people who are big exercisers, like more exercise than I do, or professional athletes, they're going to need more protein. Protein can also modulate the reverse T3 effect. So you have to play a little bit with that. But I suggest starting with 60 to 70% of your calories from fat, 20% of your calories from protein, and then about 25 net carbs per day. So enough carbohydrates to allow you to keep your thyroid working, keep your stress levels, your cortisol levels low, keep your serotonin where we want it so that you can sleep at night. But also with carbs, that then brings us to our third part of the protocol, which is intermittent fasting. So intermittent fasting allows you to eat more carbohydrates, but still kind of go to this back door of ketosis. So I'll just take a step back. We've got programmed into our DNA that if you go without eating somewhere between 14 to 18 hours, we know that that's associated with increasing your ketones. So the body starts to burn fat somewhere between 14 and 18 hours. Men tend to start to produce ketones sooner than women after an overnight fast. That's not true across the board, but you can use a ketone meter to see how fast you're able to do it. It used to take me about 18 hours to produce ketones, 18 hours of an overnight fast. Now, because I'm metabolically more flexible, it takes me about 14 hours. But the beauty of intermittent fasting, when you layer it on top of nutritional ketosis and detoxification, is that you can then eat more carbohydrates and avoid some of those risks that are associated with classic keto.
All right. So before we move deeper into the fasting piece, which I want to go deep into with you, to make sure I have the modified ketogenic diet right, what I'm hearing you say is that with your diet, it allows for a little bit more carbohydrates, and your focus is on getting a lot of these fats from plant sources versus animal. Do I have that right?
You have it right. So, what I did with my book is I included vegetarians and vegans as well as omnivores. I wanted to make sure that there was food plans for all different types of people in the way that they prefer to eat, whether that's for health reasons or environmental or ethical reasons. And what I found is that the people who are omnivores, they probably have a more rapid response in terms of metabolic flexibility. It makes sense just because, people who are more plant-based, it can be harder to get into ketosis, but not impossible. So one of the things I did on social media was I went vegan keto for 2 weeks, and I charted my glucose every day. I charted what was happening with my metabolic flexibility, and I think you'll find that there's, kind of regardless of what food plan you follow, that you can get into ketosis using these strategies.
Okay. Interesting. So I think it would be really interesting. And I know there is so many different types of diets that people are on. So it's hard to cover the basis, across vegetarian, vegan, omnivore, carnivore. We could go on and
Pescatarian,
on.
yeah.
We could go on and on. But I guess the best way to do this maybe is to look at, for you specifically, like what one of your lunches or dinners looks like when you're eating that 60 to 70% coming from fat? Because I think for a lot of people, I'm sure for a lot of people who this is new to them, that sounds like a heck of a lot of fat. And how would I go about getting that in within a meal? So if you want to talk about what a typical again, lunch or dinner would look like eating that way.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm an engineer, I think, in terms of templates, and I think templates are really helpful here. So a typical lunch for me is a salad. So I like to do kind of a base salad, and that's various different types of lettuce. I like to rotate different colors, oak leaf, red oak leaf lettuce versus romaine versus radicchio versus watercress. So all different type of dark green leafies. That's my base. I usually add a few other vegetables because we recommend for microbiome diversity about 25 different species of vegetables per week. So I typically will stick some other vegetables on there, maybe some steamed cauliflower, maybe some thinking of what I have in the fridge. I've got some purple cabbage. I've also got some Napa cabbage, so I might add that. I've got some orange bell pepper. So I like to get about 5 different colors a day. We know that's really important for immune health. So I add that to a bowl. I used to eat about a pound of vegetables a day. I eat a little bit less than that now because I'm just not as hungry because I'm in ketosis, kind of cyclic ketosis at this point. And then I'll add some protein. So that might be, let's see, I've got about 2 ounces of chicken thigh, shredded chicken thigh in my fridge. I've also got some salmon. So some sort of protein, about 2 ounces. And then I'm going to use a pretty heavy pour of extra virgin olive oil. And that's my fat. So I might use 2 to 3 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil. Depending on how I'm feeling, I might add some MCT oil. MCT oil has some special characteristics that I think we should maybe talk about. So that's a typical lunch. That's like a template of a salad that I'll assemble. And I've got these things kind of cut up and ready in my fridge so that they're ready to go. I eat a lot of leftovers. So, one of the things that I talk about in the book that really helped me when I was successful with keto, finally following this protocol, I used a lot of soups, like hearty soups. So, vegetable soups, kind of whatever vegetables you like, in a bone broth with the same sort of template where you're adding, some amount of protein. For men who are more active, they need more protein. My husband needs somewhere around 4 ounces to 6 ounces because he likes to ride centuries. He's a big cyclist. So you have to kind of figure out that ratio, but that's the template that works for me.
No, that's a great breakdown. And what I'm not hearing you say is counting calories. So for a lot of people, that's probably been, the way that they go about when they're trying to lose weight. Again, this is way more than just about weight loss, but the focus for, classically it's been on calories. So when it comes to for yourself, for, working with people that are planning these meals, how often do you talk about calories?
It's a good question. So the way I think of this is that calories matter, but hormones matter more. So that doesn't mean that we're going to ignore calories altogether. So if you're counting your macronutrients, if you're trying to get, 70% of your 60 to 70% of your calories from fat, and you're looking at your fat grams and you're calculating how much that is in terms of calories, when you count macronutrients, you are counting calories. So for people who, I've got kind of different camps of people. I've got some people who just count the grams of carbs because they want to keep it really simple. And if they're successful, I think they can get away with that. The other thing you can do along with that is to measure your ketones. You can also measure your fasting glucose with a little glucose ketone meter. And I talk about how to do that in the book. So that's kind of the simplest version. The next version is to count your macronutrients. When I find that people are not successful on this protocol, usually it's related to not getting their macronutrients quite right, like they just don't want to do the math or what, for whatever reason. So having some sort of app that allows you to count the macronutrients, I think is helpful. The third piece is there are some of us who are really sensitive to the calorie threshold. And so the benefit of nutritional ketosis is that when you're burning fat and you're producing ketones, ketones help with satiety. So you're not as hungry as you are like when I was on a Mediterranean diet and I was not in ketosis, I was hungry all the time. When I was vegan, not vegan keto, but when I was vegan plant-based, 100% plant-based, I was hungry all the time. The problem for me is that I have the kind of satiety that is very hard to hit. And so ketones help me feel sated. Now, generally, people that are on a ketogenic diet are eating a hypocaloric diet. But what I'm focused on is what's happening to your hormones, what's happening to your insulin, what's happening to glucose, what's happening to leptin, adiponectin. We haven't talked about that one, but it's produced by the fat. What's happening with your testosterone, your growth hormone, thyroid, estrogen, progesterone, cortisol. So when we look at those hormones, we need the hormones to be in balance together with getting the calories where we want them.
And when somebody embraces this protocol, and again, they're focusing on the detox, we talked about the intermittent fasting, which again, we're going to get into greater detail in a bit here, and they're you know focusing in on this diet, this modified ketogenic diet. Let's get into what the physiology, what happens with the physiology at that point. What happens with the hormones when somebody goes about making these changes?
Yeah, so there's a few different hormonal cascades that you want to be thinking about. So we know that the ketogenic diet, uh, we never say always in medicine. We never say never, and we never say always, but pretty much across the board on a ketogenic diet, it lowers insulin. And I think it's important. We've talked about a lot of different hormones. There's a bit of a hierarchy to them. So I would say at the top of the hierarchy is cortisol, because you need it to live, and insulin, because you need it to live. So those are at the top of the hierarchy. Some of these other hormones, like testosterone, growth hormone, estrogen, progesterone, you don't need them to function. Now, you're going to function better if they're in the normal range, but you don't need them to live. So, if we talk first about insulin and what's happening under the hood, what we know is that a ketogenic diet is lowering insulin. Most people who are insulin resistant have elevated insulin in their blood. That was the story for me. So, if we go back to when I was 31 and I was pregnant and I had that borderline glucose tolerance test of 134 milligrams per deciliter, I can bet you that my insulin was high. In fact, I measured it when I was 35. And I remember it came back. I did fasting insulin and glucose. My insulin was in the 20s. I think it was 27. And we want your fasting insulin to be somewhere around 5 to 6, maybe 7. So the ketogenic diet helps to lower insulin as you restrict the carbohydrates, not too much that you get into problems, especially in women, but enough to change that glucose signal, the insulin signal, that helps to lower insulin. And we know that from dozens of studies that have been done, especially the Verta trial, which was looking at type 2 diabetics on a ketogenic diet. And they found that most of the participants were able to get off of their type 2 diabetes medications. Not necessarily metformin, because that's used for other reasons, but there are other medications. So that's one of the things that happens as you start to, the other thing that occurs is that you go through this keto adaptation phase. So this is your body trying to toggle that switch back and forth between burning glucose versus burning fat. And for some of us, this was my story back when I was 31. I was kind of stuck in that burning glucose mode. I wasn't very good at burning fat. And so when I first tried a ketogenic diet, it was very hard for me to switch to burning fat. It took me about 2 weeks to do it. And during that process, I didn't feel so good. So I had what's known as the keto flu, where I had, kind of aches and pains and headaches. And I was going through this process that was not very pleasant. So that was how long it took my body to produce ketones. Now I can produce ketones very rapidly. I mentioned it takes me about 14 hours of fasting to produce ketones. I can do it very easily because I'm less carb intolerant compared to 10 or even 20 years ago. So there's one other diet that can help to lower insulin and can help to correct blood sugar that I feel like I should mention to be complete, and that is 100% plant based. Now, that means zero processed food, but 100% plant based has been proven to help with glucose metabolism, to help with metabolic flexibility, to help to reverse this high insulin level, which is known as hyperinsulinemia. The problem is not everyone can sustain that. So I had a hard time sustaining it. I mentioned that I was hungry all the time. It just didn't work with my genetics. So a ketogenic diet works much better for me. But you're asking about something else that I think is important, Jesse, which is okay, so you go on a ketogenic diet, you go through this keto adaptation, you're making ketones now. You're like a hybrid car that went from, like a Prius that went from burning gas to now burning electricity. It's more renewable because you've got more fat than you do glucose stores in the body. That's great. But what does this do over the long term? So we know that ketones are not just, some evolutionary glitch. They actually are a really important signaling molecule that helps to reduce inflammation in the body. It's a preferred fuel for the body, for the brain, especially for women over the age of 40. So I find that those women who start to have brain fog and mood issues, that a ketogenic diet can be very helpful for them because we know from the work of Lisa Mosconi that the way that the female brain utilizes glucose after 40, about 80% of women start to have kind of this problem where their use of glucose in the brain starts to falter related to their mitochondria. So for that reason, I often find that women over the age of 40, if they're good candidates, really benefit from a ketogenic diet. So it reduces the inflammasome, it's a preferred fuel for the brain, helps with concentration, with memory, and with, uh, you know, it helps to reverse brain fog. That's what I've seen anecdotally in my patients.
Lots there we can get into. And before we forget, you did mention MCT oil, and I think this can be a helpful adjunct for a lot of people, especially when they're making the switch from being, somebody that's eating a lot of carbs to a more modified ketogenic diet. So, talk about how somebody could go about incorporating that into the diet, and then again, how that type of fat it works different in the body than, our other types of fat.
Yeah, so I love MCT oil. It's a medium chain triglyceride, and it's a type of oil that we don't get much of in our diet. And so supplementing with it can be very beneficial. Now, folks may have heard of bulletproof coffee. Our friend Dave Asprey was a big proponent of making black coffee, adding some MCT oil. He also adds other things like ghee. And what I found when I first started drinking bulletproof coffee was that it was a little too much MCT oil for me. And I was just talking on Instagram Live last week about this, and I had all these people who were like, I love Dave Asprey, but the bulletproof coffee for women does not seem to work quite as well. So he's had some adaptations that he's suggested over the years for women. But the thing with MCT oil is that it's metabolized differently in the body. So it doesn't require kind of the heavy lift in terms of your gallbladder that other types of oil require. And so people who've had their gallbladder removed find that MCT oil is easier for them to digest. And because of its qualities, because it helps to raise ketones, it can help with that keto adaptation. So it can hasten the conversion from burning glucose to burning fat. It's also, I found anecdotally, really helpful for people who are just really accustomed to their nightly cocktail or their glass of wine. So I often will dose MCT for those people in the afternoon, and it reduces cravings because it's raising ketones. It kind of helps with satiety, and it reduces cravings for alcohol. So those are a few reasons why I like it. We know that it reduces hunger for about 48 hours. The trick with MCT oil is you have to get the dose right. So I generally recommend that people start with about a half a tablespoon or even a teaspoon. If you get too much of it too fast, it can lead to something called disaster pants, which we don't want. So You got to make sure that you get the dose right. And women tend to tolerate a little less than men.
So it sounds like you have into the bulletproof coffee and, the classic way it's presented didn't work for you, 100%. So where are you at today with that? Talk about what you consume coffee-wise in the morning if you do, and how much MCT oil do you put into that mix?
Well, I I tried so many different types of coffee over the years. I get jittery. I'm a slow metabolizer of caffeine. So I get jittery. I get all the side effects of caffeine with pretty much none of the benefits. So when I first started talking to Dave, this is a long time ago. When I first started talking to him, I think I met him in like 2007 or something. He said, "Well, it may not be the caffeine. Maybe it's the mold toxins that are making you feel jittery and anxious." And so I tried his coffee. I also tried Purity. I've tried a lot of different coffees over the years. I get the same effect. So I've discovered that I just can't have caffeine. I need to be naturally caffeinated. And so I use meditation to help myself kind of get that lift in the morning and that focus. So I don't drink any caffeine at all. I do love the ritual of coffee. So occasionally I'll have decaffeinated coffee. This morning I just had warm water with lemon. Again, a really good detoxifier to get that citrus together with the warm water. It's a principle from Ayurveda. So, in terms of MCT, the way that I typically use it is more on my salads or on my steamed vegetables or on my smoothies. So I typically will make a smoothie about every other day. And you can imagine with this template, the nutritional ketosis template, you can arrange your ingredients so that you're getting 60 to 70% of your calories from fat. So that's mostly MCT oil when I make a smoothie, plus nuts and seeds. You can use a protein powder, but use, a smaller dose of it. For me, I do about a half dose. And then the carbs come only from vegetables, things like frozen spinach or other frozen greens.
All right. Well, let's move deeper into the intermittent fasting piece. And I think a good way to do that is to talk a little bit more about your morning routine. So we know you're not consuming caffeine in the morning. You mentioned meditation. Let's just go through what your morning routine looks like at this point, and then we'll get deeper into your intermittent fasting and how that's evolved over the years.
So my morning routine changes, I would say, probably once a month to once every 3 months. What's working for me right now, once again, I have a template. I get up early, usually early than the rest of my family. So I've got two daughters and a husband. My husband gets up for we live in California, so he gets up for the stock market. So he's typically up before 6:30. I get up somewhere around 5:30 to 6 a.m. I make my hot water with lemon, and then I sit. There's a particular place that I sit in the big room of our house to meditate. Typically, I'll read some kind of sacred text before I meditate. What I'm reading right now is the Freedom Transmissions. It's a really interesting book about someone who's a purported medium. And I like to read a sacred text and then to meditate for 30 minutes. What I'm working with right now is mindfulness based stress reduction, or the way I like to think of it is mindfulness based suffering reduction. I've been doing MBSR for many, many years. We teach it at Jefferson. We especially teach it for um, distressed healthcare workers who I think really could use MBSR right now. So I've followed John Kabat-Zinn and I've followed his work for many, many years, but I decided to put myself back into that beginner role again. And I'm now week 4 of his 8-week MBSR program. So in his program, you've got a 30-minute practice at least once a day of sitting meditation. When you start first, you also do a body scan and the raise in meditation. So in week 4, I'm doing a combination of yoga part 2, mindfulness based yoga, alternating with sitting meditation. So today was the sitting meditation. So that whole ritual takes about 45 minutes. I find that I can't function without it. If I don't do it, if I miss it, if I oversleep, the rest of my day, I'm making poor decisions, not from a place of um, I think of it as like the green smoothie place. I'm not making good decisions from stable hormones, especially insulin. I'm making it more from a place of, um, kind of scattershot because I tend to be high in cortisol. So that's my morning routine. I imagine you want to know, when do I eat? I'm not hungry. So I almost have to remind myself to eat during the day. I typically will fast until lunchtime, and I see patients usually 3 to 4 days a week. So I try to schedule it so that I've got a little time around noon to go check in with my husband and to eat something. But frankly, I don't need to eat then.
And is this routine any different on weekends? Do you find you're ever, making a big breakfast with the family on the weekend and eating earlier, or are you pretty, strict with this routine?
So, what I found when I first started on intermittent fasting was that I needed to eat earlier. And I think some of that was related to the demands of motherhood. I just, back in the days when I was like driving my kids to school and helping them get ready for school and helping them organize their homework and things like that, I needed food in the morning. So my window at that point was usually from 8 to 6. Eat my first meal at 8 a.m., finish by 6 p.m., kitchen's closed. Now my window is a little bit later because I've improved my glucose and insulin signal. So I can eat, for instance, between 12 and 6 or 12 and 8. And I find that that works really well for me and for my family. So, part of the question, if I think about it from a precision medicine perspective, is which window fits the best in terms of helping you with metabolic health? And that differs from person to person. There's some studies that show that the early window, like 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., works better for some folks. A lot of my patients prefer the 12 to 8 window because then they don't have to be social pariahs and they can actually, go out to dinner once in a while. You asked about like brunch on the weekend. I just had some friends over for brunch. We ate in the backyard. And I did make I made a nutritional ketosis meal that we had at about 12. So that's still pretty typical. I just don't really eat in the morning. If I do, then I'll just close the kitchen a little bit earlier that day.
And for me, when I'm talking to people who are brand new to intermittent fasting, I always say the first step for people is to stop eating a few hours before bed. I think that's where people get the biggest bang for their buck if they're just jumping into this. So I'm curious, as somebody who, if you're working with somebody who this is totally new to them, and it might seem overwhelming to, extend that fast into the morning, do you think that's the most important time to cut off eating, after dinner, and then have that few hours to digest that last meal before going to sleep?
I totally agree with that. So we know from a evolutionary perspective, if you look at insulin in the body, what we know is that you become more insulin resistant in the few hours before you go to bed. And unfortunately, that's when a lot of people have their big meal of the day. So I think if you can start with closing the kitchen 3 hours before you go to bed. I also try to encourage most of my patients to go to bed by 10 o'clock and to kind of prepare for that. So I think if you can stop eating, ideally 3 hours before you go to bed, that's a great place to begin. Now, we also know that um, this is designed in our DNA, right? Like we're designed to have this period of metabolic rest. We're not designed to have a gigantic meal after the sun goes down. So the sun goes down around here around 6 p.m. You're not designed to have a huge meal after the sun goes down and then go to bed like an hour or two later. We're really designed to have this period of metabolic rest, and when you look at our ancestors, it's designed to be probably around 14 hours. So we've got that programmed into our DNA. The more that we can match up our external environment to what our DNA has evolved to do, I think that that's what helps us stay in homeostasis.
And Sarah, for you, you mentioned there the beverage you're having in the morning is a lemon tea. I'm curious what your thoughts are during that fasting period. We talked about the bulletproof coffee, and Dave was on the show after his most recent book on fasting came out and talked about how, he actually advocates for consuming a bulletproof coffee before breaking that fast as part of a morning routine. So, what I'm getting at here is What is it that you, when you're working with clients, allow them to consume that is still allowing them to get those benefits from the fast?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'm going to answer it first with a scientific hat. If you look at the work of Sachin Panda, who's probably one of the foremost researchers on intermittent fasting and fasting intervals, he would say we don't know whether having coffee with MCT or even hot water with some fresh squeezed lemon, whether that breaks the fast. Because you have to think that with coffee, when I drink a cup of coffee, it actually raises my glucose because I have a stress response to it. So it's not, even though it's 0 calories before you add the fat, even though it's 0 calories, it's not without some other effects. Same thing with green tea. So it has these biological activities in the body, even though it doesn't have calories. Now, when you add fat, when you add MCT oil or ghee or whatever you're adding to your coffee, that tends not to provoke an insulin spike, but the coffee could. So Sachin Panda's point is that we don't really know whether that breaks a fast. Now, I know that's not very satisfying for listeners. They're like, just tell me what it is. Like, I need to know one way or another. And so, what I typically say is if you can get by without drinking something that's going to change your glucose, I think that's the best way to kind of count your window. There was a study that was done at UCSD by Barbara Patterson, where she looked at women with early stage breast cancer and she asked them to do intermittent fasting as their only intervention. She then looked at the rate of recurrence and she found that women who had an overnight fast of 13 to 14 hours had a lower risk of recurrence of breast cancer. Now, she counted black coffee as breaking the fast. So she's kind of part of that San Diego scene. We've got Sachin Panda at the Salk Institute, Barbara Patterson at UCSD. So some of the research that's been done, they count it as breaking the fast when you have a cup of coffee. Now, I know Dave disagrees, but from a scientific perspective, I would say we don't know. And one of the ways that you could investigate this to see what's true for you is to do an N of 1 experiment. So you could either wear a continuous glucose monitor, I've got one in my arm, or you could, do a prick of your finger with a $25 glucose meter. And you could look at your glucose before having the cup of coffee with the MCT oil, and then look at it 30 minutes later, 60 minutes later, 90 minutes later, see if there's a change.
Let's talk about exercise again as part of this morning routine. I think you might have mentioned doing yoga as part of what you do in the mornings along with the meditation. Um, what are your thoughts on somebody? Because earlier we chatted about fit. I think you had mentioned it was doing 1/3 aerobic versus 2/3 strength training.
That's right.
So if you're going to break that into three, that's what you recommend. So for people who are fitting that into the routine, what are your thoughts about getting the exercise done before breaking the fast versus later on in the day?
So, what I recommend in terms of exercise is that you start on the small side and you build up over time. So, I'm at the point now where I do about 30 minutes of aerobics and 60 minutes of strength training with heavy weights, but it took me a long time to get there. And I'm so careful about form because, I'm old enough that I've got more injuries. I've got a torn labrum. I've got to be careful about heavy weights. So what I advise for people is that you get this 1/3 cardio, 2/3 strength training, starting first with 5 minutes of cardio and 10 minutes of strength training. Then you build up to 10 minutes of cardio and 20 minutes of strength training. Then you go to 15 minutes of cardio and 30 minutes of strength training. Build up slowly. Make sure that your body is able to adapt. Be really careful about form. Another person who writes about this really beautifully is Mark Houston. He's one of my mentors, and he's got a whole protocol that he puts people on over 6 weeks to build up to pretty close to where I am right now.
And Sarah, for you personally, after you get done that workout, do you like to extend that fast for a certain period of time? Or are you somebody that's, you've been fasting, you did the workout fasted, And then you're more into like what a lot of people do when they're working out in a conventional sense is they go and have like a protein shake or something that contains protein shortly after the workout.
Well, this is another place where N of 1 experiments can be really helpful. What I found for myself is that if I have a whey protein shake with some carbs, so about this does not fit into the nutritional ketosis, but this is more of a, I think of this as a recovery shake. So, recovery shake to help me with building muscle mass, because that's one of my goals right now. I want to preserve and build muscle mass as I get older. So, I typically have about 20 grams of carbs and 20 grams of protein, no fat, in a shake within 30 minutes of finishing my fasted workout.
Let's come back to the sleep piece. We both talked about how we agree that the first step for people, if they're getting into fasting, would be to take that chunk of time of a few hours before going to bed, let their body digest their last meal before going to sleep. When it comes to hormones, how important is sleep and getting a good quality sleep?
It's essential. I think that when it comes to your hormones, I heard someone say this. I can't remember who said it, but I loved it. He said something like, if you don't prioritize sleep, you will fall down a hormonal flight of stairs within a short amount of time. And so I heard that from a lecturer, I think at A4M, maybe 20 years ago. And I really took it to heart because so many of your hormones depend on getting good sleep. So nearly every hormone is released in a circadian pattern. So that's certainly true for the hormones that control your circadian rhythm, which is cortisol as well as melatonin. So cortisol peaks within 30 minutes of waking up in the morning and it reaches its lowest level around midnight. Melatonin starts to rise usually a few hours before you go to bed. So it's really important to be paying attention to sleep as a way of managing your hormones. If you have just one night of bad sleep, that's associated with issues with your insulin the next day, issues with your glucose. Typically, glucose is higher. You've got a higher cortisol response. You may crave more sugar, more carbohydrates as a result. So, pretty much all the hormones rely on getting good sleep. And the way we've defined that is for most of us, that is 7 to 8.5 hours of good quality sleep, very consistent night after night. Like, don't change it on the weekend. Don't do the social jet lag thing. And also, I like to track a little bit more deeply. So I use the Aura Ring, I use Garmin, you can use Whoop, you can use lots of different ways to track this. I like to track deep sleep. And for me, what I'm looking for is deep sleep of about 2 hours every night. So I know I feel my best when I've got that level of deep sleep, REM somewhere around 1.5 hours, 1 to 1.5 hours, depending on how good my sleep was the week before.
And Sarah, we are all different, but I'm curious as somebody who does, track the REM and track the deep sleep. What are some of the things you notice that you're doing before sleep that have a real impact on those?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I found through N of 1 experiments that magnesium before I go to bed makes a big difference. So I would say probably the combination that gives me the best sleep is that I do an Epsom salt bath, typically about an hour or two before I go to bed. I can't do it right before I go to bed because I'm too hot. So I do a very hot Epsom salt bath 1 to 2 hours before I go to bed. I take oral magnesium. I need a lot of it. I just know that from testing myself over the years. I need about 600 milligrams. That might be too much for other people, but that works for me. And then I need this kind of wind down period where I'm not checking email. I've got myself on a laptop curfew, so I'm not, getting that blue light exposure. I'm mostly just kind of talking quietly to my husband and to my kids and just sort of winding down and getting ready to go to sleep. So those are some of my rituals. Do you have any that you like, Jesse?
For me, it's getting that 3 hours before bed, making sure my last meal is done digesting. I am cognizant of the lights in our house. We've done a lot of changing of different light bulbs and we make sure we really minimize the blue light at night. And I'm a big fan of reading before bed. So again, you talked about your curfew there on electronics. I really like to, and my job really fits with this because there's so many authors that I'm interviewing and a lot of books to read. So I really like to take that time before bed and immerse in a book and wind down that way.
That's awesome. I love it.
So we've talked about impacting the hormones through our sleep and how that works. And also we've went really deep on the food and how that impacts hormones. What other areas of the 21st century are really having a big impact in a negative way on people's hormones that we can consider and make lifestyle changes to make, resolve that situation at least to a point?
Such a good question. So, this is my next book, Jesse. I feel like trauma is one of the most important hormone disruptors that we have right now. And when you look at trauma, not just from the perspective of, adverse childhood experiences, I check all of my patients for ACE scores. I think that's a really important piece. But not just childhood experiences. If you just look at the collective trauma of going through the pandemic, and how that has isolated folks, how it's affected, our psychological well-being. We know that depression has tripled. We know that anxiety has increased. I feel like trauma is the elephant in the room that we really need to be paying attention to. And the good news is we've got so many techniques now to deal with trauma. And without giving too much away about my next book, it's about some of those techniques, whether it's trauma informed, mindfulness based stress reduction, or as I like to say, suffering reduction, or it's CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or um, IFS, internal family systems, breath work. Uh, and then there's the whole rise of psychedelic medicine. So right now we've got ketamine, which is approved by the FDA for treatment-resistant depression, as well as some other indications. And soon, I hope, maybe in a year and a half to 2 years, we may have MDMA available as a treatment for trauma. And what's so striking, if you haven't seen this literature, if you didn't see the phase 3 trial that was published in Nature earlier this year, what's so exciting to me is that the the effect of these psychedelic medicines on trauma is durable. So it lasts a very long time. So in this particular randomized trial, it was 3 treatments with MDMA, and, from the studies, somewhere around, uh, 70 to 80% of folks no longer meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder after, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So I feel like that's one place that we're heading in terms of helping people, as well as just conceiving of trauma in a different way. I think in some ways we've kind of vanquished it to the mental health side of the equation. And I don't really believe in that distinction. I think that mental health is intimately connected with physical health and spiritual health. And we need to be considering of all these things together. So many of the books, for instance, on trauma, if you think of um, The Body Keeps the Score or Peter Levine's work, they're focused primarily on the autonomic nervous system as well as kind of the mental effects. And I want to be thinking more about the body more globally, including the hormonal system.
Well, I look forward to that next read. When can we expect the new book to come out?
Well, it's due to the publisher in about a year. So that means probably another year after that. It takes a while with the publishing system is old school, as you may know, Jesse. It'll take a while.
All right. Well, I look forward to it, and I hope we can have another chat and go into further detail on all of this. And it's interesting, Sarah, as you talk about this trauma aspect, which I'm so glad you brought up, and it's not what I expected you to bring up when I asked that question. It's definitely different than the food piece and the sleep piece because those are more objective. We can look at, we could take a food journal and look at exactly what we ate in the day, and we can use some of this technology like the Aura Ring to see quantified data on how we're sleeping. But when it comes to trauma, this is more of a subjective thing. And I can see for a lot of people who maybe their ear perked up a little bit as you went into that and you maybe realized this is an area I probably need to consider and maybe do a little bit of work in, and or at least see if there's something there. How do they begin? Because it is so subjective. And a lot of these therapies that you're talking about are just in the process of becoming legal, and we're in a time of transition when it comes to these plant medicines, which is such a great thing. I think they can really help a lot of people when they're used in the right way. But basically, for somebody in our current time where we're at with all this stuff, where does somebody begin with the trauma?
Well, you're right, trauma is hidden, and there's a way that it gets lodged in the body unless you plumb the depths. So I think the place to start is with an ACE score. So if you just Google ACE, adverse childhood experiences, a lot of the work on ACEs was done at Kaiser in the 1990s. So it was done a long time ago. But what we found is that the higher your ACE score, and that includes, did your parents get divorced? Was one of your parents, uh, did they have substance use disorder? Were they an alcoholic? Were you emotionally abused, sexually abused, physically assaulted? So there's a whole series of questions to go through. That's where I would start. I remember the last time I searched for the ACE questionnaire, I found an NPR article that was quite good. So that's, I would say, a good place to start. And then, I think many folks, myself included, go to talk therapy. And that's where we talk about trauma, but it really depends on the skills of your therapist. There's some excellent trauma based therapists who are able to navigate this particular field in a way that's very skillful. But what I can tell you is that with my experience with psychedelic medicine, I found that the insights gained are equivalent to somewhere around 5 to 10 years of talk therapy. So it's a way of leapfrogging, and I'm always looking for leapfrogs in my work. So I think that's what's so exciting about psychedelic medicine. So I would say the place to start is with your ACE score.
And again, we'll get into this in deeper in a couple of years when the book comes out. But I'm curious, is part of releasing that trauma, because a lot of times I think by default we do go to, psychedelics and talk therapy and things like that, which are again very important. But is part of that and what you're going to talk about in the book using the body and using like exercise and physical means to release some of these trapped traumas?
Absolutely, it is. So one of the things that I've seen is that I definitely have a rise in the number of patients who are coming to me, men and women, with autoimmune disease. And I found pretty much across the board that there's a very strong trauma history in these people. And so, in my work, developing protocols to address autoimmunity, starting first with gut rehab and then working on immunophenotyping and how we can improve that over time, what I find is that releasing the trauma is such an essential part of that healing process. So, we don't have robust data on this particular topic, especially with autoimmunity and trauma, but it's something that I think is so important. So, yes, the goal ultimately is to almost revisit and reintegrate the experience from deep presence. I'm going to get a little quieter here because I think this is so profound. From deep presence, which then turns into this deep medicine for healing. And the deep presence is something that I haven't been able to do on my own. The deep presence comes from working together with a very skilled psychotherapist. I've got a lot of them that I've worked with over the years who can provide that deep presence and also hold the space for me to provide the deep presence for my own trauma. So this isn't about me. This is about those of us who've experienced trauma, which is most of us, and how do we create the medicine to heal the trauma and the downstream consequences of trauma, whether that's autoimmune disease or depression or anxiety or PTSD, treatment resistant depression, whatever it is.
Really fascinating stuff. And I'm really happy you're writing on the subject and bringing more light to it. Sarah, this just like all the other conversations we've had has been a lot of fun, and we're bringing so much to the listeners, and I just really appreciate you and the work you're doing and for taking the time to come on the show. This is our fourth time together, and I hope there'll be many more down the line.
I hope so too. I love what you do, Jesse. And I just want to say, oh my gosh, you're about to have your second baby. I'm just so excited for you and your wife.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations.
We're so excited too. We've loved being parents to our daughter Sorel, and now we have another boy coming into the picture, and it's going to change things up again and bring on all sorts of beauty and new challenges, and I look forward to it. But Sarah, other than people getting a copy of the current book, Women, Food, and Hormones, how can they connect with you after the show?
So the best place is the website, saragottfriedmd.com. I also hang out quite a bit on Instagram, so that's a good place to interact with me. I'm trying to do something on TikTok, so there's a little activity over there. My daughters are trying to clue me in. Yeah, at some point, hopefully that'll be a little more robust, but those are the best places.
All right, I'm going to link it all up in the show notes. Sarah, again, thank you so much, and we'll keep in touch.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.